Willow Creek was a small, quiet town, a place where nothing seemed to happen, but beneath its calm surface, tension simmered. The kind of tension that wasn't spoken of openly, but everyone felt it. Racial divides, unspoken prejudices, and a gang of troublemakers who made life harder for anyone who didn't fit their mold. Among the town's residents was Brian, a man who seemed to go unnoticed by most. He was quiet, kept to himself, and lived a simple life in a modest house at the edge of town. Every morning he walked to his job at the hardware store, worked his shift without complaint, and returned home the same way he came, calm, composed, and silent. But Brian was different. The way he moved, the way he spoke, when he did speak, hinted at a depth nobody could quite put their finger on. Some whispered about him, wondering where he came from, why he lived alone, or what his story was. But no one dared to ask. And Brian, he never offered answers. In the center of town, however, there was another group, the so-called Creek Boys, a gang of locals who prided themselves on intimidation. Their leader, Kyle, was the kind of man who thrived on power and fear. His group would pick on anyone they deemed weak or out of place. Immigrants, minorities. It didn't matter. They enjoyed the chase, the cruelty, and the control. And then one day, Kyle noticed Brian. To him, Brian was the perfect target. Quiet, alone, easy to corner. What Kyle didn't know, what no one in Willow Creek knew, was that Brian wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was carrying a secret, and that secret was about to make Willow Creek a place they'd never forget. Brian didn't want trouble. He never had. That's why he lived the way he did. Quiet, under the radar. A simple life in a complicated town. But sometimes, trouble finds you whether you're looking for it or not. It was a Thursday evening, just like any other. Brian's shift at the hardware store had ended, and he was making his way home. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows on the streets of Willow Creek. The town was unusually quiet that night, except for the faint hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. But as Brian turned the corner near the old convenience store, he saw them, 5 men lounging by the side of the road, laughing, drinking, and tossing cans onto the pavement. The Creek Boys. Everyone in Willow Creek knew who they were. They weren't just a gang. They were the kind of people who thrived on intimidation. Bullying wasn't just a pastime for them. It was a sport. Their leader, Kyle, leaned casually against a rusted pickup truck, spinning a baseball bat in one hand. He spotted Brian almost instantly. At first, Brian pretended not to notice. He kept his head down, his hands in his pockets, and his steps steady. He'd walked this road countless times before, but tonight, it felt different. Kyle's voice cut through the stillness like a knife. "Hey, you! Where you going in such a hurry?" Brian didn't stop, didn't even flinch. His silence was enough to catch Kyle's attention. "Hey, I'm talking to you!" Kyle's voice grew louder, more insistent. The other gang members stopped what they were doing and turned to watch. "Look at him," one of them whispered, "acting like he can't hear you." Kyle smirked, but it wasn't a friendly kind of smirk. It was the kind that made people uneasy. "Nobody ignores me," he muttered, pushing himself off the truck. Brian could hear their footsteps now, closing in behind him. Slowly, he adjusted his pace just enough to let them think they were in control. "Hey!" Kyle shouted again as he stepped in front of Brian, blocking his path. The other 4 gang members quickly formed a loose circle around him, like wolves closing in on their prey. Kyle tilted his head, sizing Brian up. "What's the matter, huh? You too good to talk to us?" Brian finally looked up, meeting Kyle's gaze. His expression was calm, too calm. It wasn't the look of someone afraid or angry. It was something else entirely. "I don't want any trouble," Brian said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. Kyle laughed, but it was a hollow laugh, the kind that masked insecurity. "No trouble?" he echoed mockingly. "You think you can walk through here, act like you're better than us, and not get trouble?" He tapped the baseball bat against his palm, the dull thud echoing in the still air. Danny, one of Kyle's lackeys, stepped closer. "You better say something, man. Kyle don't like to be ignored." But Brian didn't take the bait. He just stood there, silent, his eyes locked on Kyle. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, and for a moment, Even the gang seemed unsure of what to do next. Finally, Brian spoke. His voice was low, but his words cut through the tension like a blade. "Be careful," he said. "You don't know what you're starting." Kyle blinked, caught off guard. The other gang members exchanged confused looks. "What's that supposed to mean?" Kyle demanded, stepping closer. Brian didn't answer. Instead, he took a step to the side, smoothly moving past Kyle and walking away. For a moment, the gang just stood there watching him go. Kyle clenched his jaw, gripping the bat tighter. "Hey!" he shouted after Brian. "You think you can just walk away?" Brian didn't stop, didn't turn around. He kept walking, his steps steady, his shoulders relaxed, as if nothing had happened. Kyle's lackeys looked to him, waiting for his next move. "You gonna let him do that?" Danny muttered. Kyle's smirk returned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "No," he said slowly. "This ain't over." As Brian disappeared down the street, the gang huddled together, already planning their next move. Little did they know, the man they had just tried to intimidate was far from ordinary, and soon they'd regret ever crossing him. Kyle wasn't the type to let things slide. That night, as Brian disappeared into the shadows, Kyle's frustration grew. The look in Brian's eyes, the calmness, the silence, it had gotten under his skin. By the next morning, Kyle had already decided Brian needed to be taught a lesson. It started small, as these things often do. The Creek boys would hang around near the hardware store, loitering by the entrance. When Brian walked out, they'd whistle or shout things like, "Hey, quiet man, where you off to?" Or, "Too good to talk to us, huh?" Brian never responded. He'd glance at them, just for a second, then keep walking. But Kyle wasn't looking for patience. He was looking for a reaction. One evening, Brian came home to find graffiti sprayed across the side of his house. Big, ugly words scrawled in red paint, words no one should have to read. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the vandalism. Then, without a word, he went inside, came back out with a bucket of paint, and covered it up. The Creek boys watched from a distance, snickering. Kyle leaned against his truck, arms crossed, waiting for some kind of outburst. But Brian gave him nothing. "Man, he's boring," Danny muttered, kicking a rock. Kyle's jaw tightened. "Number? He's disrespecting me," he said. "He thinks he's better than us." The next day, they stepped it up. Kyle and his crew followed Brian home after work, driving slowly behind him. They blasted music, revved the engine, and shouted insults. "Hey, you got something to say now, huh?" Brian didn't look back. He kept walking, his steps calm and steady. But this time, Kyle wasn't satisfied with just words. The truck screeched to a halt in front of Brian, cutting him off. Kyle jumped out, followed by the others. "You deaf or something?" Kyle said, stepping right into Brian's path. "I'm talking to you." Brian stopped, his eyes meeting Kyle's. "I don't want trouble," Brian said, the same calm tone as before. Kyle laughed, loud and exaggerated. "You don't want trouble? Well, you got it, friend. You think you can just ignore us? Walk around like you're better than everyone else?" The gang circled around Brian, their voices getting louder, more threatening. "Maybe he thinks he's too good for us," Danny sneered. "Or maybe he's just scared," another added. Kyle grinned, the baseball bat resting on his shoulder. "So, what's it gonna be, quiet man? You gonna say something, or are we gonna have to make you talk?" Brian's eyes shifted, just briefly, scanning the group. Then just as quickly, his gaze returned to Kyle. "You're making a mistake," Brian said quietly. The gang erupted into laughter. Kyle stepped closer, the bat in his hand dropping slightly as if daring Brian to react. "Oh yeah?" Kyle said. "And what mistake would that be?" Brian didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, just enough to create space, and then turned away. "Hey!" Kyle shouted, but Brian kept walking. For the second time, Kyle let him go. But this time, his frustration boiled over. "That's it," Kyle muttered, tossing the bat into the truck bed. "This guy thinks he's untouchable." "What are you going to do?" Danny asked. Kyle's smirk returned, dark and determined. "We're going to show him what happens when you mess with the Creek boys." By the end of the week, Brian's car tires had been slashed. Trash was thrown onto his lawn. And one night, Kyle and his crew broke into his backyard and shattered his windows. Through it all, Brian stayed silent. He repaired what he could, cleaned up the mess, and continued about his life as if nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't stop. Kyle wasn't just trying to scare him. Kyle was escalating. And Brian? He was running out of patience. For weeks, the Creek boys kept pushing. Harassment turned into vandalism, and vandalism turned into threats. But Brian? He never gave them the reaction they were looking for. Until one night. It was late, well past midnight. The streets of Willow Creek were quiet, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Brian sat alone in his modest living room, the soft glow of a single lamp lighting the space. Outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the stillness. He glanced out the window and saw them, the Creek boys. 5 shadows, their faces illuminated by the headlights of their truck. Kyle stepped out first, bat in hand, followed by the others. They were loud, laughing, and carrying bottles. But this time, they weren't stopping at the edge of his property. Brian stood, his expression calm, but his eyes sharp. He moved toward the door as the sound of glass shattering pierced the night. One of the gang members had thrown a bottle, and it hit the side of the house, leaving shards scattered on the ground. "Hey, quiet, man," Kyle shouted. "You gonna come out and talk, or you gonna hide like you always do?" Brian opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The gang fell silent for a moment, surprised by his sudden appearance. Kyle recovered quickly, a smirk spreading across his face. "There he is. Finally decided to join us, huh?" Brian didn't respond. He stood there, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. Kyle stepped closer, the bat resting on his shoulder. "You've been disrespecting us for weeks now, walking around like you're better than us, like you can't be touched." The others closed in behind him, forming a loose semicircle around the porch. Brian's voice was calm when he finally spoke. "What do you want?" Kyle chuckled. "What do we want?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe we want you to show a little respect. Maybe we want you to stop acting like you're untouchable." He leaned in closer. "Or maybe we just want to see what it takes to break you." Brian's gaze didn't waver. "You should leave," he said quietly. Kyle's smirk faded. "Excuse me." Brian took a step forward, his voice steady but firm. "I'm telling you to leave, while you still can." The gang erupted into laughter. Danny clapped Kyle on the shoulder. "You hear this guy? He thinks he can tell us what to do." Kyle's grin returned, but this time it was darker, more dangerous. "You got a lot of nerve, quiet man, but you don't seem to understand how things work around here." He raised the bat, pointing it at Brian. "You don't get to tell us what to do." Brian didn't move, didn't flinch. His voice was calm as ever when he replied, "This is your last warning." Kyle laughed again, louder this time. "Oh, you're warning me now? What are you gonna do, huh? You're just some nobody living in a crappy house on the edge of town. You think you scare me?" For a moment there was silence, and then Brian's expression shifted, just slightly. His shoulders straightened, his stance widened, and his gaze sharpened. The change was subtle, but it was enough to make Kyle hesitate. "What's the matter?" Brian asked, his voice low. "You're not laughing anymore." Kyle's grip on the bat tightened, and he took a step forward. But before he could say another word, Brian moved. It happened so fast the gang didn't even see it coming. 1 second, Brian was standing on the porch. The next, Kyle's bat was on the ground, and Kyle himself was on his knees, clutching his wrist in pain. The others froze, stunned into silence. "What the hell just happened?" Danny muttered, stepping back. Brian didn't give them time to recover. He turned to the nearest gang member, disarmed him with a quick twist, and sent him sprawling onto the ground. One by one, the gang tried to fight back. But Brian was faster, stronger, more precise. Within moments, all 5 of them were on the ground, groaning in pain. Kyle stared up at Brian, his face pale. What are you?" he stammered. Brian leaned down, his voice low and cold. "I warned you," he said. "You don't know who you're messing with." He straightened up, looking at the gang scattered on the ground. "Get off my property, and don't come back." The Creek boys scrambled to their feet, helping each other as they stumbled toward the truck. Kyle hesitated for a moment, looking back at Brian. But the look in Brian's eyes was enough to make him think twice. Without another word, he climbed into the truck and they drove off into the night. Brian watched them go, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The Creek boys might have driven off that night, but Kyle wasn't done. His pride had been shattered. For someone like him, humiliation wasn't something he could let go of. The next morning, Brian went about his usual routine. He cleaned up the shattered glass from his porch, repaired the dents on his door, and repainted the scratches left by the gang. To anyone watching, it looked like business as usual. But inside, Brian was waiting for them to make their next move. And it didn't take long. 3 nights later, the sound of roaring engines broke the silence. 2 trucks pulled up to Brian's house, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. Doors slammed as Kyle and 7 other men spilled out. They weren't just carrying bats and bottles this time. Kyle had brought a crowbar, and one of the men carried a chain. Brian heard them coming before they reached his porch. He stood in the center of his living room, calm and focused. He'd been preparing for this moment. Outside, Kyle shouted, "All right, quiet, man. No more warnings. You want to mess with us? Let's see how tough you really are." The gang swarmed the yard, smashing flower pots, kicking over lawn chairs and throwing rocks at the windows. Inside, Brian waited, listening to every sound. And then, the front door burst open. Kyle stood in the doorway, the crowbar in his hand and a smug grin on his face. "There you are," he said. "Let's see if you're as quiet now." Brian stepped forward, his expression calm. He didn't say a word. Kyle took a step closer, raising the crowbar. "What's the matter? Nothing to say." Brian's eyes locked onto Kyle's, and for the first time, the gang leader felt something he wasn't used to. Fear. And then, Brian moved. It was over in seconds. Brian disarmed Kyle with a single fluid motion, twisting the crowbar out of his hands and sending it clattering to the floor. Before Kyle could react, Brian's fist connected with his chest, sending him stumbling back onto the porch. The gang rushed inside, shouting and swinging their weapons. But Brian was faster. He moved like a ghost, sidestepping their attacks and taking them down one by one. A kick here, a punch there. Every move was precise, controlled, and devastating. Within minutes, the room was silent. The gang lay sprawled on the floor, groaning in pain. Kyle tried to crawl toward the door, but Brian stepped in front of him, blocking his path. Who are you?" Kyle gasped, clutching his ribs. Brian crouched down, his voice low and steady. "You don't want to know." Kyle's eyes widened as Brian pulled a phone from his pocket. He tapped a few buttons, and moments later the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. "What's happening?" Kyle stammered. Brian stood, his gaze cold. "You think you're untouchable because this town lets you get away with it. But I'm not from this town." The sirens grew louder, flashing lights appearing in the distance. "You're about to find out who I am," Brian said, stepping aside as the police arrived. The officers stormed in, quickly handcuffing the gang members. Kyle tried to protest, shouting about how it wasn't fair, but the officers ignored him. As the last gang member was dragged out, one of the officers turned to Brian. "Do you want to press charges?" Brian shook his head. "No need. Just make sure they don't come back." The officer nodded, tipping his hat before leaving. As the chaos faded, Brian stood alone on his porch, watching the taillights of the police cars disappear into the night. The quiet returned, but this time, it felt different. Inside, Brian sat down at his kitchen table. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Inside was a photograph of a younger version of himself, standing in a foreign desert, surrounded by men in tactical gear. A faint smile crossed his lips as he traced the edges of the photo. They'd pushed him too far. They'd wanted to know who he really was, and now they did. Brian wasn't just some quiet man living in a small town. He was a spy, a soldier, a man who had seen and done things they couldn't begin to imagine. And in Willow Creek, no one would ever forget it. For the first time in years, Willow Creek was quiet. Not the uneasy silence that used to hang over the town, but a true peaceful quiet, the kind that comes after a storm has passed. The Creek boys were gone. Some left town, too ashamed to face the people they'd terrorized for so long. Others stayed but kept their heads low, knowing their reputation had been shattered. And Kyle? He'd spend months answering for his actions. As for Brian, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. He still walked to the hardware store every day, still greeted the neighbors with a polite nod, and still lived in his small, modest house on the edge of town. But something had changed. The whispers about him grew louder. People in town began to talk, piecing together the fragments of what they had seen and heard. Some said he was ex-military, a war hero who had come to Willow Creek to escape his past. Others claimed he was part of some secret government program, sent to the town for reasons they could only guess at. Brian, of course, said nothing. He let the rumors swirl, let people draw their own conclusions. But every so often, someone would ask him, what really happened that night? And Brian would always respond the same way, with a faint smile and the words, just a misunderstanding. One evening, as the sun set over Willow Creek, Brian sat on his porch sipping a cup of tea. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. It was peaceful, until his phone buzzed. He picked it up, his expression calm but alert. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but Brian knew better than to ignore it. Brian speaking, he said, his tone steady. A voice on the other end, calm and professional, replied, we've been watching. You handled yourself well. Brian's eyes narrowed. What do you want? The voice paused, then continued. We need you back. There's work to be done. Brian didn't respond immediately. He glanced out at the horizon, his mind racing. He had left that life behind for a reason, but now it seemed it was catching up with him. After a long silence, he finally replied, I'll think about it. He ended the call and set the phone down on the table beside him. For now, the quiet life he had built in Willow Creek remained, but in the back of his mind, he knew it wouldn't last forever. Some battles can't be avoided, and when the time came, Brian would be ready.